Here we have Chapter 2C, Defense Mechanisms, little tools that we use all the time to protect our egos. So defense mechanisms, what are they? We can consider defense mechanisms to be processes through which we distort reality to protect the ego. And if we didn't do this, we would get anxiety. So our ego is that reality navigator, and when we let ourselves down, we have to find a way to kind of bolster that ego again so that it can be strong, and Freud would say healthy. And so we use these little tools. You'll find them in yourself probably. So dissonance is like, you've probably learned about it in social psych. It's like when two conflicting ideas are present at the same time. And so if we have an id impulse and our ego, or worse yet, superego, finds it unacceptable, then we have to resolve it. So if we have a desire to, take something that isn't ours, take the last piece of cake and just eat it or something like that, then we have to rationalize this to ourselves because we've just failed ourselves a little bit. And some examples here below. If we have kind of anger that could lead to violence, our ego is, especially if we engage in violence, is going to work through that. Or if we fall in love with someone, but we shouldn't, like we fall in love with someone who's married or inappropriate for us, we have to reconcile that. Desire for what's forbidden, each of these are id impulses that would bring about dissonance. We'd have to work with it. And so the risk of these kinds of id desires are that we might act inappropriately, we might violate laws even, or we might just feel anxiety over having this desire or action. So then we put up these mechanisms. They prevent us from acting, or they quell our desire, or if we have acted, we've eaten that piece of cake, they reconcile guilt afterwards. So we're going to talk about them in 3 categories. Your book doesn't necessarily line them up this way, but I find it helpful. So first we'll talk about immature defense mechanisms, used usually by younger children. They're pretty simplistic, like denial, acting out, regression, and projection we'll talk about. They don't get you anywhere. They don't solve your problem. And neurotic defense mechanisms, these actually serve the opposite effect. Like, we do them in the moment, but in the end they tend to increase our anxiety because they don't resolve things at all. And these are called isolation, also called intellectualization. And then we can also talk about repression, displacement, reaction formation, rationalization, devaluation. None of these things resolve the desire. They just help us get through the moment of the desire. And then mature defense mechanisms, they do actually help us cope with daily stressors. They're effective if we use them well. They take strength and awareness. And the ones we'll talk about are sublimation, suppression, altruism, humor, and forgiveness. So first, the immature defense mechanisms. Denial, just we don't even acknowledge that something has happened or that we've experienced something. Just some examples here. No, I don't have a crush on him. Right, just flat out saying no, denying it to yourself. Or, I know I hate sugary foods too. Well, the person really likes sugary foods, but they don't want to be looked down on, so they kind of deny it. Or someone who is a smoker or a drinker and says things like, look, I can quit anytime I want to, so just leave me alone. They deny that they have a problem. And if they continue this denial into adulthood, it's called distortion. They get a distorted view of reality. So this isn't really helping anything, this denial, because the id drive is in fact present. Probably there are behaviors that are unhealthy that are happening, and this person isn't even acknowledging that a problem exists. Another one is projection, claiming that one's own impulse belongs to another person. And these seem so weird when you think about them, but let's say that a person really wants to get the boss's job. The boss is leaving and this person really wants the job, and they don't want to admit that, for whatever reason the society puts on them that they should be humble and not have those kinds of high aspirations. And so they look at someone else and say, oh, she's acting that way because she wants to get the boss's job. Or the case of a man who desires a woman and looks at another man being kind to that woman, it would project his own desire on her. Well, he only treats her well because he wants to sleep with her. Or, you never listen to me. Even that is a bit of projection from someone who maybe never actually listens to their partner. And I felt like we saw a lot of this in the recent political campaign, especially in the kind of the blaming that tend to happen, like, oh, that's just a big money grab. When one politician would accuse another of, say, grabbing for money, or of using the Supreme Court to their own advantage, or weaponizing something. And there was a lot of projection that seemed to be happening in our recent political campaign, but I don't know if you followed as closely or are aware of examples like that. Immature defense mechanisms continue. Acting out, just a plain old temper tantrum, right? You can't have what you want, so you're letting it out in another way, kind of distracting yourself from it. Some people might categorize cutting, that kind of thing, that some adolescents or some people do. Putting cuts in one's arm, and that might be considered an acting out, an immature defense mechanism, because it's transferring emotional into physical pain. Or, a child whose mom brings home the new baby and they start breaking things, they don't know what to do with their jealousy, and so they're acting out, and it doesn't solve the problem. And then regression, well, we all do this once in a while, I think. When we have a really tough day at work, we maybe just go home and we want to have that macaroni and cheese and curl up under a nice warm blanket and watch our favorite sitcom. That's regression. And it brings, comfort in the short term maybe, and helps to bring emotions back, into a more settled state, but it doesn't really solve any kind of a problem. And laying in the fetal position, an example of this, the comfort foods I mentioned, watching old familiar TV shows. All of these are like regressing into that childhood state, giving us that feeling of being comforted by doing things we did in childhood. It doesn't solve the problem, though. We move now into neurotic defense mechanisms, those that actually make the problem worse in the end by putting the problem deep inside us, where it can manifest as a physical concern or come out in another way. So isolation, also known as intellectualization. We can think of a problem as having emotional, behavioral, and cognitive components, by cognitive meaning thought components. And we need to kind of reconcile the emotion with the thought in order to have a healthy resolution. But sometimes it's easier to just sever those two. And so if we sever the emotion from an idea, then the idea is still there, but the emotion has been deeply buried within us and is likely to come out later. And sometimes you see this in people who have been through a traumatic experience. They're talking about it in a very, very calm way, without any emotion, and yet it's very apparent that this would have been a deeply emotional event, and the emotion is so deep or so profound for this individual that they've isolated the emotion, they've put it away, and it's likely to come out later in them. And so instead of feeling, they just think about it. You can picture maybe someone who recently was in those terrible California fires being interviewed, and undoubtedly there's deep emotional pain and they're intellectualizing. I learned to recognize the futility of possessions. Whatever emotion is there has been tucked away. Hopefully, maybe this thought is expressed after the emotions already came out. That might take some time though, because this person might have to work through reconnecting the emotion with the thought in order to have a healthy resolution. Repression is kind of just the opposite. That's why these are on the same slide. Once again, we have a severing of ideas from emotion, but in this case, the idea has been repressed and maybe even forgotten. But the emotion always arises. And some kinds of post-traumatic stress disorder involves repression. People who don't remember what happened, but they have emotional arising at factors that resemble a traumatic event. And so I gave this example of a woman who discovered her father's sexual behavior. They were, maybe taken aback, very shocked, or maybe it was a really problematic sexual behavior. And so they've just blocked the idea out of their mind completely, but they still find that when they walk by that room, they still shudder without even knowing why. So the memory itself has been blocked, but the emotion, the triggers, the sensory signals that come in can still trigger emotion, but the cognition is linked to it. So both of these are problematic. The person is going to have to link these two back together and work through that in order to have a healthy resolution that doesn't come back to bite them later. More neurotic defense mechanisms: reaction formation. You behave in the manner opposite your impulse. You have an impulse to hit somebody, or to hit your spouse, and that angry hand instead massages their back or something like that. Usually it's the opposite of what someone wants to do, and it's exaggerated. So I think I have more examples here. Ted Haggard is a classic example. It's kind of dated now. You may not know about it. Let me see if I have his picture here. I can't remember. I don't. I'll just tell you a little bit here. He was a pastor who was sat in a big old pulpit preaching against homosexuality, and then it turned out that he was in fact gay and had, even hired homosexual prostitutes. So that's like reaction formation. He's so troubled by this urge for something he doesn't approve of. His superego doesn't approve. His id wants it. His ego doesn't navigate it well, so he touts the message of disapproval, but that desire wins out in the end. And that's reaction formation. He had a hyper reaction against his own homosexual urges. And treating your boss like extra kindly because you just can't stand him, like you don't want to feel that way about someone, but you do, and so you react completely in the opposite way. It's dishonest with yourself, and so that brings about problems. And moving on, displacement, transferring energy from one object to another. The classic example is your boss, gives you a lot of grief at work, and so you displace your anger toward your boss into your child or your pet or something like that. You come home and kick the dog, something like that. And there's Ted Haggard coming up too late. He's the one I mentioned here under reaction formation. We also have rationalization. We do this all the time. We explain things to ourselves. It reduces dissonance. So we cut someone off on the highway, say. Well, we hardly ever say to her, if someone cuts us off, we usually say, "Oh, jerk, what are you doing?" Something like that. But if we cut someone else off, we usually explain it to ourselves. "Oh, I'm not usually the kind of person who cuts someone else off, but I had to because I was late. And plus, he was really driving so slow, he was kind of dangerous." And so we often rationalize when we do things that we think we shouldn't have done, things that are in conflict, when we have that dissonance. So your friend wants you to help move and you don't do it. You just stay home and you feel really bad about it because what a lousy friend you are. And then you rationalize to yourself, "No, I couldn't help because, my back problem." So you're rationalizing. It's going to, in the end, kind of not benefit you. Devaluation is like sour grapes. There's a classic Aesop's fable in which a fox wants to get some grapes for whatever reason and jumps and leaps and tries in many different ways to get the grapes, and he can't get them. So finally he walks away disconsolately and says, "Those grapes are probably sour anyhow." Well, that's what we sometimes do. If we want something we can't have, then there's that same kind of dissonance, and so we find negative flaws in it. If someone has rejected us romantically, we might say, well, that person's kind of a jerk, and look at what that person does. Look at the kind of car they drive, something like that. Here's the example. He was such a big jerk anyhow. I can't believe I went out with him for so long. So that's a devaluation. Instead of honestly appraising and acknowledging the pain that comes along with being rejected, not being able to have the great, we're instead telling ourselves a story, and stories that don't face reality don't benefit us. You don't get a job in France and you say something like, oh, I really didn't want to move anyhow. And you do that to quell your own disappointment. Mature defense mechanisms are ones that benefit us in the long run. They help us grow and help us become healthy people on this earth. Sublimation, if we have that desire that we can't accept in ourselves, we could sublimate it by transferring the aggressive urges into something more productive. And so if we do have like an urge toward aggression, and we get actively involved in a sport, that's sublimation. We're taking that urge toward aggression and we're transferring it into a socially acceptable outlet. So having desires that are unacceptable and finding healthy ways, healthy alternatives. Suppression, so this one is somewhat linked to isolation and repression. You'll remember those two from before. And that's when the emotion and the thought are torn apart. Both isolation and repression tear apart the idea and the emotion. And in suppression, well, if we just say, I think often about my nephew his wife left him, and it was very painful. And he experienced the pain, he cried, he sat with it, and he was aware of what happened, and he faced it. And then he decided, okay, I've had that pain, and now I'm going to move on. I'm going to mentally stop thinking about it and move on. And so, if the pain crops up, he maybe allows it. He doesn't push it away. He doesn't separate it from what happened. And then it passes and he moves on. And so that's like a clean way to deal with emotional pain. You have to be very mindful. When the pain arises, we always want to reject it and freeze around it, isolate it, push it away. But the better way is to allow it by being mindful and paying attention to what's in the present. We can also anticipate or plan for a different future is another way that we can suppress. Once those unhappy thoughts keep arising, we can be aware of them, and then we move on consciously through our own intention, our own mindful awareness. Another way is through gratitude, consciously thinking of things that we're grateful for can bring about emotions that override the pain that we've been experiencing. And then finally, altruism is helping others. Instead of focusing on your own pain, your own dissonance, your own disconnect, your own id drives, you focus on what other people need. And that can really have a great relief to pain and dissonance if we're just focusing outside ourselves and on others. It's a great cure, a great way of reconciling these kinds of dissonance within ourselves. And humor, finding something to laugh about, can be a terrific way to cope with the arising of unhealthy, dissonant sort of influences, not denying it, but laughing at maybe our own human weaknesses, the foibles that we seem to come into contact with again and again. And that too deflates the id kind of drive and the tension in the moment. And then lastly, forgiveness. Consciously, even if we've been harmed, it doesn't mean that you let someone continue to harm you. It just means that you stop letting the harm that person has done live within you and harm and damage you. So there's the damage that was done to you, and you don't allow it to be done to you anymore, but you also don't hold inside of you like hatred and resentment and anger that in the end don't hurt the person who harmed you, they hurt you yourself. And so you forgive and stop feeling resentment, stop feeling indignant, stop feeling anger. You don't let yourself be a doormat, but you let go of the emotion that will otherwise cause you to harm, just as if you were swallowing poison. That's what anger, resentment, indignation are. It's like a poison, and you keep holding it inside of you. Forgiveness lets that go. So that's what we mean by that. All of these are also ways of resolving the kind of dissonance or uncomfortable situations that arise in all of us.